Hello and welcome to today's episode of Next Wave TV. I'm your host, Tony Reale. Today we're going to be looking at creating realistic anamorphic lens flares to be used with digital cinematography. Anamorphic lens flares are commonly used in big budget production movies such as Star Trek, Transformers, and many others. They add a certain level of production value, and it's become a staple of many action movie genres. The problem is, for smaller time productions, anamorphic lens flares are fairly difficult to create because they are actually created through the lens and using anamorphic lenses. But these lenses can cost upwards of several thousand to tens to 20, 30, 40, 50 plus $1,000 for very, very high quality lenses. And for most smaller time production companies, this is just not an option. But we're going to be showing you how to create these anamorphic lens flares to be used with any type of footage that you capture, and it's not going to be costing very difficult. What we're going to be using is a plugin called Video Copilot Optical Flares. And let me pull this up. This plugin is $125, but when you compare it to the cost of big budget anamorphic lenses, this quickly becomes a non-issue. So I highly recommend picking up this plugin. There may be ways to do this without this plugin, but it's so versatile that I recommend just picking it up. There are also several tutorials on how to create lens flares. So I'm not going to be going over how to actually create these lens flares. I'm just going to be showing you ones that I've used and how to use them in your footage. Before we get started though, let me show you the footage that we're going to be recreating. This lens flare effect you see here is just a simple dolly shot. It's similar to something you might see in Transformers, whereas this one is something similar to you might see in Star Trek. My friend Dan actually ended up stopping by and he needed to pick up a plumbing snake from my house, and next thing he knew he was surrounded by cameras and lights, and I asked him to film these clips with me. This one I wanted it to look kind of like Transformers, so I had him pick up a small alien device that could save the world if he helped bring an alien robot back to life, which actually was a projector bulb from my old projector. And for the next clip, I had him pretend like he just found out that a alien was going to destroy his planet, and he was in total shock. So something similar to Transformers and something similar to Star Trek. Here is a good example. I had a bright blue light shining on him to be the motivator for this lens flare. You don't have to do this, but it just adds to the authenticity if you plan ahead and know where you're going to be putting your lens flares. Just makes it look more realistic and more believable in your footage. Note the camera shake that you see towards the end of that. That's something we're going to also look at recreating. This footage was captured on the Canon 5D Mark II high-definition DSLR camera, and as you saw in the previous footage, it was using a type of camera shake, which can be somewhat difficult to create since the Canon DSLR has a certain level of rolling shutter that happens with it. So we're going to go over that too. But first, let's start off with this light bulb flare for this type of footage here. So we're going to go ahead and take our footage and drag it into a new comp. And as you see right here, we've got our footage, and it's 16:9 footage, like I said, captured on the Canon 5D Mark II. But because we're going to be doing an anamorphic look, we might as well go ahead and use anamorphic widescreen settings. So let's go into the composition settings and change this to 1280 by 544. It's regularly 1280 by 720, which is a 16:9 aspect ratio, but we're going to change that to 544, which creates a 2.35 aspect ratio, which is the commonly used for anamorphic widescreen. We'll click OK, and now we're just going to drag our footage down a little bit so that we get it centered the way that we like it. I'm going to go ahead and go back up to 100%. And now what we're going to do, now that we have our main comp, we're going to change the name of this to main Luma comp, and we're going to go ahead and duplicate that by clicking Control D, and we're going to change the name of this to Luma Matte. Alright, let's go ahead and open our Luma Matte, and it's going to look identical to the previous comp. But what we're going to do here is take a filter called Colorama, and we're just going to drag that on top of this footage. At first we get this crazy psychedelic look, which is not what we want at all. We're going to change the output cycle to ramp gray, and it gives basically a black and white image. But what we're going to do is create another color picker, and we're going to make that solid black. We're going to drag it around and make a very, very dark image and pretty much block out anything except the light bulb. Again, we're going to create another color picker by the white and make that solid white. We're going to drag that back until we get pretty much a solid light bulb right here. That's what we want. Now I'm going to create another mask around this, just a simple mask using the elliptical tool. And basically we're going to use this mask and make a very, very rough track of the light bulb. You could track matte this entire project, but I find this to be a little more easy, and it also helps when you're revealing the footage where his face is coming across the footage over here. This is so much easier than changing the brightness, because it'll all happen within the Optical Flares plugin, which I'll show you later. But let's go ahead and get started here. We'll go back, and for the mask I'm going to create a new keyframe for the position of the mask. We're going to scrub back, and we're just going to animate the position of this mask here, and just make a few keyframes, and it automatically creates those keyframes. And maybe we'll make one more, just a little bit, and kind of get centered. And now we'll go across, and that looks pretty good. Now if you look really close here, you see we're getting a little fall off, and that's around his eyes and the hat. We don't want this though, because the filter will think that that's a separate flare, and we'll get little bitty flickers along here. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the mask expansion to negative value until that gets covered up. So right now we're at negative 26. Let's go ahead and scrub through there and just see how that looks for the most part. And overall that looks pretty good. I think that looks actually pretty great. So let's go back into our main comp, and we're going to take the Luma Matte and we're going to drag it on top, and we're just going to make it invisible because we don't really need it to show up, we just need it in our comp. Now we're going to create a new layer, or new solid, and we're going to make that black and click OK. And now we're going to go into Effect, Video Copilot, Optical Flares. First thing that shows up is just a basic flare just on top of the footage. And this is basically in 2D space. We can navigate it around, position it, and we could theoretically keyframe it just like this. But because there's so many great features built into Optical Flares, we're going to go in and we're going to change the source type to 2D and change it to luminance. And now we're going to take the luminance options, take the source layer, and change it to Luma Matte. And now you can see it's really, really, really bright. And so we're going to go in and adjust the settings. We're going to take the brightness and we're going to drop it down to, let's say, 40 at 40, and see how that looks. And then we're going to also change the black solid and switch it to screen. So now it's over the top. And if we quickly scrub through here, we see how it goes from nothing and slowly gets bigger and bigger, and then goes completely normal size. One thing we want to do is get rid of track color, because we want to use the color that's in our lens flare on top of this. And then, but we want to leave track brightness and track scale on, because what happens is when the Luma Matte gets smaller as his face starts to cover up the light, the scale base of this white solid gets smaller, and that tells the lens flare to get smaller. So it just like in a normal lens, as the light gets bigger, the lens flare would get bigger. But this isn't an anamorphic lens flare, this is a regular lens flare. So let's go ahead and go into the options, and we're going to pull up a preset lens flare that I created for this comp. I called it Luma Flare. Like I said before, there's tons of great tutorials by Andrew Kramer on how to create your own lens flare, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but I'm just going to click OK. And then once again, I'm going to change the settings a bit, maybe drop the scale down. Actually, that looks pretty good right there. Let's just scrub through and see what it looks like. Alright, pretty much that's pretty good. I mean, you can adjust things a little bit. If you find that the light's too low, instead of trying to adjust the position, you can just go into the Luma Matte right here and take the whole layer and just move it up a little bit, and then you can go back into the comp, and that will be, everything will just be adjusted there. So I think that looks pretty good. So I think we're set there. Like I said, if you want to adjust this, go ahead and fine tune it. But this is a great example of how to take just basic footage and add a quick lens flare without doing too much work. You could track each position, but that would add a ton of extra work. I think this did a great job in just a few minutes. And to show you another example, here's some footage that I shot just in my kitchen. And we shot this and did the exact same effects to it, a slightly different lens flare. But this is just the camera moving back and forth, and you can see how the anamorphic flare was tracked on top of it. So you can add this to moving footage. It doesn't have to be slow moving like this. It's a very easy technique, so I recommend playing around with it. Go shoot something, just play around with it and see what you can come up with. Alright, let's go back to our project, and we're going to take our camera shake footage, drag that onto a new comp, and once again this is 16:9 footage. And so if we want, we can also take our composition, go into composition settings, change it to 544 to get that anamorphic look. We'll just go down here. Now first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new camera and change that to 50mm would probably be good. And it's going to say this only affects 2D layers. That's okay. And we're going to make this layer 2D. Or 3D, I should say. We're going to make this layer 3D. So we click on the 3D box there, and now it is fully three-dimensional. Next thing I'm going to also do is create a new null object. And we're going to rename this null object Camera Controller. And this is what we're going to use to control the position of the camera and do some special effects to it. So we take this pick whip, we just drag it over to the controller, and now wherever this null object moves, that's where the camera is going to move. Alright, now next thing we're going to do is just take this footage and drag it back in Z space a little bit, and we're going to change the scale so that it fills the frame back up again. Also, what I want to do is I want to add an effect called motion tile, and that's going to save us if the footage goes to the edge. We're not going to get this black bar on the side. Instead, we're going to click mirror edges and change the tile width, or I should say we're going to change the output width to 150 and 150 for the height. And so now you see here we are getting a border around it. At the top and bottom are kind of obvious, but on the sides it gives you just a little bit added length, so that if the footage does go off screen a little bit, it doesn't show just black. Alright, now next thing we're going to do is create a new light, and we're going to tell this to be a point light. Click OK. Now if you notice, the footage just got a little dimmer. That's because it's using this light and thinking that it's supposed to be reacting to the light. So if we click on our footage, hit AA, and go down to accept lights and turn that off, now our footage will not be affected by that light. Alright, now next thing I want to do is change active camera to top view, and now we can see we have our camera is right here, and we have our footage right here, and the light's just kind of sitting in the middle of that. I want the light to be more on the edge of where the camera is. So if you see the camera spreads out here, I don't want the light to actually be on frame. I want it to be slightly off frame. We can adjust this more later, but this is a pretty good position right here. So if we go back to our active camera, and I'll fill the screen up with this again. Now we're going to create, once again, a new solid. And we're going to go back and add the After Effects Optical Flares effect. And now instead of changing, we're going to change the positioning mode again, but instead of changing to luminance, we're going to change it to track lights. Now what that's going to do is that's going to take any light that's in the comp and change that into a optical flares light. Now since we're playing around with kind of a Star Trek effect, let's go ahead and pull up a preset that kind of has an Star Trek look. And we're going to pull up the JJ preset. This just comes with the Optical Flares plugin. And one thing I like about this is it's got built into it a function called dynamic triggers. And dynamic triggering is really great function. Once again, Andrew Kramer goes into more detail about this, so I'm not going to explain it too much. But as you see, as the light goes off frame, it spikes in brightness and kind of creates this really cool, overpowering look, which is something that was commonly seen in the Star Trek film. So let's click OK. And as you can see right now, we've got a really cool effect. And if I drag this light around, the lens flare goes with it. And if I pull it off frame, I get this really cool spike. And this is exactly what we want. We want to use this spike to create a kind of shimmering effect with the camera. Now, if we go back and change this again to screen so that we can actually see our footage behind it. Now, right now, if I just scrub through it, it's kind of boring. The light just kind of stays there. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some camera shake to it. And for this, we're going to use a Video Copilot preset called Aftershake. I'm just going to go into my effects and presets and type in Aftershake. And right here we have Aftershake Null. I'm going to just take this and drag this onto our camera controller. And now automatically it gives us kind of a violent shaking, which is somewhat similar to a earthquake, which is not what we want at all. We want something more subtle, more like a camera shake that you see in normal handheld move. So if we go into the rotation, I'm going to change this to 5. I'm going to change the amount to 100, but I'm going to change the speed down to 0.5. Now if we scrub through that, we kind of get more of a natural hand movement. But the thing that I noticed in handheld footage is it isn't limited by a specific range. It can vary where you're doing handheld footage, and then all of a sudden your hand gets tired. You might drop a little bit more than normal, but go back to normal. So there's kind of a variance in handheld footage. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a simple expression to add a little more variance to the amount of the Aftershake plugin. So if we hit our Alt key and click on the slider, that pulls up our expression tab. And we're going to add a simple expression, type in wiggle 1, 100. And this is telling it that every 1 second we're going to have it wiggle 100 amount. If we go back, it's not too noticeable here, but what we're basically doing, and you can notice up here, is this value is changing anywhere from a range of -100, or from 0 to 200. And this creates a more realistic handheld movement. You can tweak these settings as much as you want, but I've noticed that this kind of creates a very realistic handheld look, and we're also avoiding the normal problem that you would get from the 5D, which is a rolling shutter issue. So you can shoot your footage right on a tripod and add that handheld look later on. The other advantage we're getting is the light is literally in the composition. So when the camera moves, the light reacts to it. And we're getting that cool anamorphic lens flare where it spikes when it gets to the edge of the frame, and perhaps we might want to bring it closer and go into the settings and increase the scale and maybe decrease the brightness a little bit. And you could just play with the settings, or perhaps you would want to decrease the scale and increase the brightness. You can do whatever you want just to get that effect that you're really looking for, and you can get some really cool effects that happen from that. So I hope this was helpful. This is just an example of a couple things that you can do. Andrew Kramer has a lot of great tutorials, and I find Optical Flares a great plugin for doing motion graphic work. But my favorite part of it is that I can finally add realistic anamorphic lens flares to my digital footage and not have to look at spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on very expensive anamorphic lenses. I can use the lenses I already have and add this great feature to it. Make sure you don't overuse anamorphic lens flares. It's more of a little bit of spice to add a great flavor to great footage. And lastly, I'd like to invite you to visit our website at creativeedgepro.com. Here you can find a lot of the projects that we've been working on recently. In addition, there's the different websites that we have, which include our blog, which has a lot of tips and tricks and behind-the-scenes information. Of course, our YouTube and Vimeo pages, our Facebook page where you can become a fan of Creative Edge Productions, and of course our Twitter page where you can follow us. Again, that's at creativeedgepro.com. Thanks for watching and have a great day.